So prepare yourself now for 45 minutes of non-evidence-based information instead, because this would be my truly sort of subjective story. Although I come to realize that parent stories are strikingly similar, even if you go outside Sweden, you go across Europe or even the world, it sort of contains the same elements. So I hope that my stories reflect some other parent stories as well. And thank you for inviting me to talk to such a distinguished crowd as you are. I would like to start my presentation by asking you a simple question that you don't have to answer to, but why are the parents present at the NICU? And when I ask other crowds that are much more uninformed than you are, they always say, oh, maybe it's for legal reasons, maybe it's because they love their children, maybe they just want to be there. And that's not wrong, but all of you in here know that we have another purpose, that we do have another agenda. It's not hidden, but we know it's for the benefit of the babies. It's to improve the medical outcome of the babies that we need the parents to facilitate the skin care. So we are actually using the parents as tools to have the best outcome. And that means that if we are using the parents, I say parents because now in Sweden I could say mothers, but it's the same thing. Then we also have to make sure that they come home in sort of one piece. That we don't, by saving a sick baby, sort of create a sick family. And I think all of us will want to do better than that, actually. Our story starts in December 2010. This is my son, Svante. And to some of you, you might say he doesn't look that prematurely born, and that's true because he's not. He was born 40+2, he weighed 3,650 grams, and he is the sole reason why me and my wife didn't sort of care about the second pregnancy at all. We had a due date on the 12th of April on my birthday, and we said, well, let's care about this when we get to March. Here's Svante during Christmas holiday at the Canary Islands. He's on top of the world. Has both his parents with him. He's a single child. He's fast and energetic. And little does he know that he's about to become a big brother in 2 days. And neither does the guy behind the camera know that I'm about to meet that sort of small person within my wife's womb and spend 3 extra months with her. Actually, my wife's pregnancy had been a little bit difficult. She had been increasingly tired. She got increasing contractions. So when we were about to go for this holiday, we went to the maternity care to have it checked out. But no blood tests were taken, no infection parameters, and we were told that, well, your wife is probably just stressed out, so maybe it's good for you to go on holiday to the Canary Islands. And she was stressed out, of course, but it didn't get better, it got worse. The contractions got worse, and on the flight home the day after this, she had problems to sit. We managed to get home, and after a while she had a small bleeding, and we went to the hospital to have her checked out. So we managed to get home from the Canary Islands, which would have been sort of a very difficult situation in week 24, as this was. But what we didn't know was, by going to the hospital that day, we wouldn't return the 3 of us together for a longer period of time at our home until 3.5 months later. My wife was immediately transferred to the Karolinska Hospital here in Stockholm. This is actually taken at SÖS. You know, sort of, this is the way to Rackabacken, actually, I think, isn't it? Yes. So, and she was transferred to Karolinska Hospital later that night with a cervix insufficiency, and I spent the day after that there with her, but then I went home to fetch my son. We were at our neighbors, and I just felt this urge to look at my phone to check if she was okay. Right then, the phone rang, and it was just my wife screaming, the baby's coming, you have to get here now. So I left my son at our neighbors, and just rushed to the hospital, drove really, really fast through Stockholm, and I came just in time to have a quick talk with the neonatologist that was in service. And he said what to expect was a child that was going to be very, very small, very sick, and very quiet. And when I asked him about the chances of survival, he said, well, it's about 50-50, 60-40, back there in 2010. And when I asked him about chances of survival without any severe morbidity, because that was quite important for me back then, he said, well, maybe 25%. It's hard to say numbers, of course. And back then, those odds were far too bad for me. I was a Swedish father, caring about security all the time. I was used to counting odds in 1 in a million. My problem was like, should I go to the Canary Islands with Ryanair or with SAS? And I always ended up choosing Lufthansa. And that was just because Qantas didn't operate Las Palmas to Stockholm. You know. So it was like an external threat. And I said, well, if you stand in the situation that you don't know whether to save her with a disability or let her go, I just want her to let her go. Because at that time, that was something I thought you could say. 20 minutes later, my wife gave birth to our daughter in week 24 plus 5. She weighed 735 grams. She came out the normal way, and I even had time to cut the navel cord. And she was rushed out to the emergency room, and I followed. And when seeing her lying there, and her upper points were all 0 to begin with, she was tiny and red, and I saw she was struggling. I just prayed to God and said, like, take her home, because we got to see our unborn child now, and maybe it's time for us to go home and continue to live as a family. Just the 3 of us. Maybe we can become pregnant again, but we just want to get out of here. But fortunately, the doctors thought otherwise, and they intubated her and took her up to the neonatal ward. And of course, that is something that I felt immense guilt for since then, that I sort of denied my own daughter the right to her existence. In our society, that's blasphemic to say that you don't want a child. But at that time, things weren't that holy. So, we were quite young, we had just bought a house, we were both freelancing singers, our working situation was quite fragile. This child became like an external threat, and I just wanted to get away from it. So, but it sort of made me think a lot about those fathers being in the emergency room and what they experienced, and that they might be needing some help afterwards. Well, suddenly a nurse came and took me out to the neonatal ward, and this is the person I found in the incubator, Freddie. I just stood there for like 15 seconds before everything started beeping, and people came rushing and they were doing life support, and I remember that I was just backing out of the room, going down again to the delivery room to meet my wife. So that was our first sort of real meeting. During the first couple of weeks, my daughter's condition was anything but stable. She had severe RDS and an infection. And we lived as parents do, minute per minute, sometimes hour per hour, but never day by day. And that sort of continued for quite a long time, up to sort of 3 or 4 weeks, and made us extremely, extremely worn out and tired. But I also got increasingly annoyed by the staff always greeting me for having a daughter. Congratulations to your daughter. It's fantastic. And I was like, how can you congratulate me to being in this situation? I just want to go home. But gradually, the words kept sinking in. And I slowly started to engage in the care of our daughter. I started to change her diapers, not in the same hospital as Stine worked, but in another hospital. I started to change her blankets. I started to disinfect the handles of the incubator. I started to know how she wanted to lie, how she was feeling, and all that. And that, I started to care about her. And I started to realize that I was actually the father of 2 kids now, and not just 1. And I would say that that was like a subsidiary bonding process for me and my daughter. I say subsidiary because it was a one-way process. It was me accepting my responsibilities as a parent. But seeing her sort of, or just starting to care for her, also made it more difficult for us to see her suffer, of course. And to be able to handle those stressful situations, we did what most parents actually do, that they sort of brace themselves, that they cover themselves in steel. We have in Swedish an expression called stålsätta, which is called to steel yourself to something. It was like putting on an armor to keep the outside world outside and the inner world inside. It was totally chaos inside, but on the outside we looked quite rational. And it worked because I can handle a lot of stressful situations, many at a time. And that armor just grew thicker and thicker. But that armor had a huge backside, that when my daughter later in life wanted to connect with me, and when my life sort of called me back and said, well, it's time to continue living your life, that armor was incredibly hard to take off. And that will be sort of one of the themes of this presentation, this armor, metaphorically. How can we make it thinner for the parents, and why is that important? Because there are things that made the armor actually thinner, and one of those things were, of course, taking care of my daughter, but apart from that, conversations with the staff, with you if you work in the NICU. That's something amazing that the nurses and also the doctors always took on our grief and sorrows as they came. Of course, it's invaluable to have psychological support, but my breakdowns didn't follow like a schedule. I didn't always break down at 15 o'clock Friday afternoon. It could come late at night when I was changing a diaper. And then this nurse always was there, and we were sort of starting to talk, and she asked me questions, and I would tell about my situation. And I never felt that they assumed that they knew how I was feeling, but I always felt like they were showing me sort of a way forward. And I have encountered this actually in a clinic for spinal injuries here in Stockholm called Spinalis, where they have all their staff educated in a method called Socratic dialogue, where sort of the physiotherapist or someone else working with the patient can, when the patient sort of starts crying or doesn't want to be there anymore, they can just stop the session and just talk for 5 minutes, and then they can go on, and they save a lot of time and energy by that. Something else that, of course, which this picture shows, eased a lot, was sit skin on skin with her, and those hours with her, just me and her falling asleep, waking up again, keeping her warm, checking on her breathing. It was a fantastic experience, and she still sort of crawls up my chest nowadays, always, even though she's 135 centimeters long. She tries to sort of stay there, and I want her to stay there. This is something that made me reconcile with this period. I had the privilege to speak at another seminar here in Stockholm, which I think you all know of, Björn's fantastic work, the Ultra Early Intervention, about music therapy, and how I used to sing to my daughter when she was lying on my chest. And I didn't know then that this could be called music therapy, that I was humming sort of slow tunes to her while she was lying there. But as I worked with the presentation there, and then I realized how I was not singing to my daughter lying there, I was actually singing with her. It was not me singing songs to her, it was us communicating in a way, because I could always try to be responsive if she liked it or not, if I was humming fast or slow enough, it was too loud, and she would respond actually, even though she was, what was she, 2 weeks old? She was she was like 27 weeks there, and then we sort of communicated. That was a fantastic experience, and I hope that many people and many parents get to get that actually. And of course, there were things that made that armor grow thicker. And for many of you, this will come as totally obvious, but I think it's important to state. Anyways, change is incredibly difficult for these parents, because they are, or us parents, we're thrown out in a crisis, and what we do is that we try to connect with safe bases all the time. We try to connect with, it could be an incubator, it could be a room, it could be a person, it could be a care routine, it could be a specific brand of an incubator. Everything that seems remotely safe and where things has begun to go in the sort of right direction. And if someone comes and tells us, well, we're going to change this, that's always a reason to brace yourself and expect for the worst. And then sort of the armor grows thicker immediately. And of course you can't avoid change because you have to, and this goes also for changes to the better actually. But there is a factor that I think is important, and that's time. That you can sort of endure the biggest changes if they don't happen fast. But if they're slow and you get a chance to reflect and come back with questions and feel safe, then you're much more likely to endure that change without any sort of without any damage. And the next thing is going to be three things. So stay with me. The next thing is conflicts of any kind. It could be conflicts about small things that I didn't care for before or after, but in that situation made me react extremely emotionally and irrational. And you know how that is when you're sort of put in a corner. You're supposed to be the grown-up one, you're supposed to be the rational one, and you're all emotions and you can't discuss at all. And what is the worst thing that can happen then? I think it is when someone's trying to rationalize or trying to keep on to that rational argumentation all the time, not acknowledging that you're totally emotional. And that's so, it's universal. You do that with kids and partners and all the time, but I've seen it happens with so many parents and staff as well, that they're trying to bang those rational arguments towards that bubble of only emotion, and you don't get anywhere. Of course, there's a better way to just back off a couple of steps, let the situation cool down, mirror the person, play along, and then gain confidence and come back again. It's basic, I know. The third thing is identity. That at that time, I was a fairly successful opera singer, and I was used to people actually knowing who I was and what I stood for, and well, that it was my identity. And a lot of the other parents are as well. They could be lawyers, they could be drivers, they could be economists, anything. They're used to having their professional role, but they're in the NICU. You're just a parent. I was just by myself, alone with my sort of also existential thoughts, which could be troubling in itself. And I was wandering around in these ugly sweatpants and the slippers, not knowing, looking miserable, sort of tired. And that could have been fine, but in discussions and in stressful situations, that can complicate a lot, and that gap of status becomes a problem. And I think it's important to acknowledge parents' actually normal status, but it's also important to stress that the interaction between the parents are often about those things, that they acknowledge each other's where they live, what they do, sort of what they like to talk about, and that creates a bridge between the hospital environment and their normal environment. Actually, this is an example of when the changes doesn't always have to be to the worst. It could always also be to the better. This is here in Södersjukhuset, and my daughter is big enough to come out with the CPAP. And of course, that's wonderful news that she's about to come out with the CPAP. But I was like, I don't think so, because now she's gaining weight and everything is going the right way. Why don't we keep this CPAP on for like 2 or 3 days just to make it a little bit more stable, and then we can take the CPAP off and see what happens. Why rush? And I actually managed to postpone this withdrawal for 2 days. But then one morning, a nurse came to me and said, well, Kalle, today was going to weigh your daughter, and we thought it would be fine to do it without the CPAP and everything. So couldn't we just do that? I was like, okay, let's do it. And we took off her cap and the clothes and the CPAP, and finally we took off the monitoring and we put her on the scale, and she was lying there with naked. That was the first time since she was born that I saw my daughter actually without any gear on. And it took a father to love her. I realize that now when I look at her, those pictures, because she'd been having this CPAP on for quite many weeks. But even though it was a fantastic experience, it was a wonderful moment, but after 30 seconds I said, well, okay, I'm fine, I've seen my daughter now, and please put the monitoring back on, and we sort of can be safe again, because I can look at the numbers at the screen. And they were like, no, just lay her on your chest, and you can see how she's looking, she has nice color and everything. So I was like, okay, let's stay in this chair. And then this picture was taken, and maybe 2 minutes after that, I was like, okay, for the sake of my well-being, put the monitoring back on, because I've had enough now. And they were like, okay, let's do it. We put it on. And then the numbers came up, and it was 100%. Her saturation was better than it ever had been before. She was so happy to get rid of that CPAP. And for me, that was like she was born that day, that she actually showed me that she was there to stay. And the only thing that wasn't good with that moment is that my wife wasn't there to experience it. And that I have to say that, well, my wife was present, but all the pictures are actually showing me, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't another present. And I will come back to that later, why that moment is so important. Finally, 2 weeks before our due date, we got to go home. Yeah, there they are. There they are. We got to go home, and I was exhausted after 3 months at the hospital, and I wanted to lay all the energy that I had on my daughter. But still, I had to sort of, instead of that, I had to fight a lot to make her needs met. There were a lot of relatives being unresponsive, having colds that they didn't. Well, they said that they didn't have a cold, even though sort of they were a little bit snotty and all that. And we have child care experiences that were not that good. But the hardest thing was taking on the responsibility, I think, for the care of my daughter, to become the primary caregiver, that I was leaving the hospital behind. And we took that responsibility really, really serious. We took it so serious that we actually, for a while, became not just primary caregivers, but primary health caregivers, in a way, but I will come to that. We took her home, we lied her sideways in the bed, sort of, and we arranged the bed so that it was possible to adjust the leaning of the bed by small straps, and we sew her nest, and we put up a device so we could shelter her from impressions. We took the breathing alarm, put it on her belly and then on the side of the wall, and then we said like, nice, now it's just exactly like home at the hospital now. So relax. But of course we were taking on the role as parents. She became sort of like a little bit of a medical project. And it went quite far. It went like I couldn't look at her. I couldn't see her without monitoring her. I was constantly looking for small things that, small errors that I could be preventive about and call someone about. And it was, I actually wrote something about that. It's a small sort of poem that I published on a blog, but I will try to read it in English. I laid my eyes on you today, but I didn't see you. You were there, but your reflection within me kept escaping. I tried again, I swear. I dared to look right at you, and yet I only saw the bed you were lying in and the sheets you were lying on. I must get closer. If I lay myself beside you, so close that I can hear you, and the sound in you that says that you're still alive, my heart just beside yours, only with a little bit of skin and pajamas in between, and there you take place within me, and I cry and I care about you. So when she wanted to reach me, as I said, I was somewhere else, hidden in that armor. And I was so afraid of losing her, and I so many times expected the worst, so I had a hard time understanding that she was actually there to stay. So I couldn't actually see the truly amazing thing that was going on in front of my eyes, that she was growing and she was developing, and she started to connecting to other parts of the family, and I were somewhere else. And I'd like to think of my bonding process as divided into 2 steps. But the first step was this that I told you about at the hospital when I started to act as a parent. But the thing is that those duties you can perform with your armor still on. You can be totally disconnected and still change a diaper. That's fine. But the second process, that is the real bonding process, when you have to open up for interaction and have to sort of see that your baby can love you back as well and open up for emotions. That's a totally different story. And in order to have that, you have to feel safe. You have to know that the medical follow-up is there for your child. And that is, I think, the answer I would like to give you to your question. That if you don't provide the children with proper medical follow-up, they might as well, of course, use all the skills they get as being responsive parents, by Meetup and everything, to just monitor their children, in a way. But the answer to that is not to have less medical, less responsive parents. It is to have more medical follow-up. Because if you have medical follow-up, you can relax. You don't have to be a caregiver. You can be a parent instead, because you know someone else will check on and your baby. And that's also why I think this armor thing is quite a good metaphor, because if it's thin enough, then it's easy to break through, and the parents can connect to their babies, they can connect to their social environment, they can also connect to themselves, or the parents could sort of form their relationship again. Because I would like to talk a little bit about this. 2 years after we came home, me and my wife separated. And I won't say it was my daughter's birth was the sole reason that we separated. It was a lot of other stuff as well. But it was kind of a watershed still. And I thought about when entering the NICU and entering the hospital, you do it like two individuals. I think it was hard to show each other affection there. It was hard to have physical intimacy, of course. It was hard to sort of support each other. It was also hard for us to understand that we had two totally different coping strategies. My coping strategy was to talk a lot. It was to blog about our experiences. It was sort of, I wanted everyone to benefit from sort of the horror we were going through. My wife's coping strategy was exactly sort of as valid as mine. She wanted to mourn a lost pregnancy. She wanted to get to know our baby in a slow pace. She wanted me to shut up. And I don't think it's so simple when I look at it now, but back there and then, we didn't realize it at all. And what would have happened if we would have sort of gotten some help to acknowledge each other's reactions and sort of try to lie that behind us before we got home? Because what happens is that when you get home and you slowly start to recover and you're entering the reorientation phase, as I call it, I will talk about that later, starting to come back to life, you sort of wake up one morning and say, where were you when I was feeling that bad? And if you weren't there for me then, will you be here for me now? Can I count on you? Are you reliable? And you started to read in all kinds of things. Are you reliable in taking out the garbage in the morning? And you're starting to, it creates a lot of conflict actually. And as I sort of analyzing this afterwards, it's so easy to analyze this whole story, of course, in psychological terms. In Sweden we have, I would say, famous psychologist. He's called Johan Kullberg, and he stated these 4 phases of handling a crisis. The first is a shock phase. It's quite short. It can be seconds to hours to days. Then you have the reaction phase, filled with emotions of fear, grief. It could be joy as well, sorrow. And then you have the process phase, which could be as long as it takes, actually, where you often need psychological counseling. And then you have the reorientation phase, where you try to find a new way of living. And what's interesting with this, if you apply that to my story and to preterm parents in general, I think you all see that having a preterm baby is not an isolated event. It's just having it is, of course, an isolated event, but then something else happens. Then there's a complication, then there's a stressful event, then there's like a saturation drop. So that means that those parents, I will use this now, they go from the shock to the reaction phase, and then they maybe, they're on their way, and then they go back to the shock, and then they go to the reaction phase, and then maybe, no, they're going back to the shock, and then they sort of going between those, maybe for the whole stay at the hospital. Maybe they don't get to the processing phase at all before they come home. And if I would apply that to me, I would say that my processing phase maybe started a little bit when my daughter took breaths by herself on that chest. Because then maybe I could feel a little bit secure that things weren't to get worse. We maybe sort of through the worst things, and I could start to process the things that we're going through. But I would say that the reorientation phase didn't come until maybe a year after we came home. And I think many parents stay in this shock reaction phase for much longer than I did. And what do I want to say with that? Well, since as important as medical follow-up is, psychological support is, even after you get home. Because of course you want to support the parents in the NICU, in their reactions, and sort of be there for them. But if you want to be part of the processing phase, maybe you have to reach them when they come home, after they come home. Because then is when they go into their processing phase. Something else that I think is interesting is that this period of the processing over to the reorientation phase. Of course you can push that a lot. You can always do that. You can do that as sort of forget all about the experiences that you had and just say, well, it didn't happen, just go on with my life now. And then you have a very short process phase, and then you go straight into the reorientation. And I can see that with myself, but also with a lot of other parents that sort of try to forget that their babies are preterm, that they are preterms. They sort of said like, well, let's just leave the hospital behind and go on with their lives. And that works if the trauma is an isolated event. I think that works quite fine. But these babies need proper follow-up. They will be continuously reminded of their trauma without sort of handling it. Or worse, maybe they will deprive their children of that medical follow-up because they don't want to face the trauma themselves. I know it happens. And I know many parents that won't sort of acknowledge that their babies are preterm. They weren't, actually. They always say, why do you want to put the diagnosis on my child? Why is that important? Why do you want to give my child a stigma? It's an interesting discussion. I think I've come to the end now. Sorry if I look at my papers. I want everything to be there. Well, yeah, about this processing phase and going into the reorientation phase. We didn't get a chance to just forget about everything, because 1 year after we got home, my daughter was diagnosed with a mild cerebral palsy and through an MR scan. And that sort of 1 year after just threw us right back into that trauma thing. But it was quite interesting to see how I was reacting compared to my reaction having a disabled child in the beginning. But now I had a much more tolerance for my life changing without me having control over it. I sort of accepted I couldn't control everything. I accepted that things change and I have to go with it. And that's why my presentation could be called Dare to Change. Because it's sort of, that is the thing, that you have to acknowledge that this thing happened and life changed and I didn't choose it, but something better came out of it. And that's the way it should be. My daughter is now almost 7 years old. She's definitely the love of my life. When she calls me nowadays, she always gets my full attention. Maybe she gets a little bit too much attention sometimes. And even though this mild cerebral palsy, she's shown that when trained in the right way, her will to heal is enormous, and she's adaptive, and she's not hindered at all by her disability. And sometimes I think that will to heal goes for the parents as well. But we have to make sure that they don't lock up themselves or cover themselves in fear and turn away from themselves and their babies and never get the opportunity to embrace this fantastic thing that actually is change. Because as I used to say when I'm presenting in English, that neonatology isn't just about saving tiny babies, but actually saving big families. Thank you.